Connective tissue structure is determined by the extracellular matrix rather than the cells. The matrix is made up of a ground substance, which is just the stuff that it's all in. Most of the time, that's a gel, but it can be all the way to fluid or all the way to solid in special cases. And then spread through the ground substance in most connective tissues are the protein fibers. There's a few different kinds that we'll talk about next. And I'm running out of markers that actually show. The type of fiber and how they're arranged is going to affect the overall structure. The three types are called collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers. Collagen fibers, sometimes they'll look like this. They're usually stained pink, but it depends on what we added to the slide. They're fairly thick, and they're tough. It's a bunch of little proteins, strands, twisted together like little bits of fiber making a big rope. Collagen fibers are flexible. You can bend them, but you can't stretch them. That's going to be important for structure in things like tendons and ligaments, where you're trying to hold two structures together like bones or a muscle and a bone, and you don't want them to be able to stretch apart. And in more solid tissues like cartilage and bone. Elastic fibers, as you might guess, do stretch. So they're like a rubber band. It's easy to stretch it, and when you release the tension on it, it shrinks back to its original size. They're not as tough as collagen because the stretchability makes them more delicate. So they'll be used in places where stretch is important. Your skin actually has both elastic and collagen fibers because it needs to be able to stretch as you bend your joints and pull it across them. But it also needs to be tough to keep things from breaking through it. Blood vessels, where the blood pushes against them and makes them stretch, are going to have elastic fibers. And some areas in your airways, like the lungs overall, have a lot of elastic fibers so they can stretch to inhale. How they look would depend on the sample and the slide, but they're often crinkled like this. We saw some last week in the areolar tissue, which we'll see coming up, that weren't quite as crinkled up because of the way they prepared the slide. They just kind of spread it all out so they get stretched and preserved that way. The third type, reticular fibers, are like a scaffold. These are stiff. So elastic fibers can bend and stretch. Collagen fibers can bend but not stretch. Reticular fibers can't do either. We're not going to look at a tissue that has them. The one that does is just called reticular connective tissue. These are used in certain organs like the liver and spleen and lymph nodes, those little things that get swollen in your neck when you're sick, to just hold the structure of the organ. So they don't provide a lot of protection from damage, but they keep the organ from just squishing in on itself. Questions on fiber types? Classifying connective tissue is by matrix, just as classifying epithelial tissue is by cells. We start with connective tissue as a whole. I'm going to do an organizational flow chart here. So like, we have this. Based on this property, we go here or here, and then based on those, we go a couple of other different places. This is one way you might like to organize information when you study, especially if you're more flexible in your thinking and don't always go well with just outlines. So first thing we look at is the ground substance. Category called connective tissue proper has a soft gel as its ground substance. Not yet, gel. Then everything else is called specialized connective tissue. Specialized connective tissue can have either harder or softer ground substance. There's blood, which has a fluid. Cartilage, which has a hard gel. So think of the difference between like standard Jell-O and the jigglers, where it's more going to hold its shape. And then bone is fully solid. Then within each group, after we've looked at the ground substance, then we look at the fibers. For proper, CT, we have loose and dense. In loose connective tissue, the fibers are more spread out. In dense connective tissue, they're packed closer together. Blood has no fibers at all. Bone only has one variety, but then cartilage has 3 different types that are based on differences in the fibers. They're called hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. Can you guess what kind of fibers elastic cartilage has?
Elastic fibers.
Yep, elastic fibers. So we'll take a closer look at some of the types of loose and dense, and then each of the specialized. Questions on the general structure and organization? Loose, okay, I did mention reticular here, even though it's not one of the ones we looked at in lab. Reticular connective tissue has reticular fibers. It provides structure but isn't protective. Areolar has both elastic and collagen. And just reaching out any direction. The areolar is a delicate tissue. It can't provide any structure, but it can hold things together, and it has a good blood supply to provide nutrients to other ones. And then adipose, it has collagen fibers, but you usually don't really see them that well. What you see is large cells that are storing fat. those bubbles we saw in lab. If you saw a nucleus, it's one per bubble because the bubble is the cell. Under dense, the only one we're looking at is dense regular. It has collagen fibers that are parallel. And sometimes you can't even really see the cells in there because they're just squished in between the fibers. Dense regular often forms ropes. It's like collagen is a microscopic rope. Dense regular puts a bunch together to make a larger rope, like a tendon. There are some other types of dense connective tissue, but the book doesn't cover them here. We'll look at one variety in chapter 6 that's found in the skin. So, to go a little more specific on what each one looks like and where it's found, your areolar connective tissue is underneath epithelial layers. It forms that basement membrane that feeds them, and between muscles. And it's just for connection and nourishment, no structure. Adipose. There's a layer under the skin. It's around some organs to provide padding for them, like the kidneys, the heart, and the eyes. So you got adipose tissue behind your eyes so that if you bump them, they don't smack against the back of your eye socket. There's some adipose tissue between muscles where there's a bigger gap. It's good for filling in the space. The fat is there as energy storage, but just by being there, it also provides some padding and some insulation against heat loss. While it's not 100%, you've probably all met somebody who's thin and always cold, and somebody who's heavy set and always hot, and that's because of the insulation.
I'd get some more of that. Eat. I'm always so cold.
Me too, man.
I eat like crazy though, so.
Either you're active or you have a fast metabolism.
A little bit of both, probably.
As long as you're not like hyper and your heart's always pounding, stuff like that, could indicate excess thyroid hormones.
No, I don't have that problem.
You're fine then. So, probably healthier to just wear a sweater when other people are sitting there in tank tops. So, reticular, liver, spleen, and lymph nodes, reticular fibers, obviously. So it can provide structure to the organs, but not really any protection. So your spleen, which is up over in here, gets a little bit of protection from ribs, but it can be damaged really easily because all it's really got holding it together is this reticular connective tissue. So this one won't be in the lab. Your dense regular, parallel collagen fibers. This is one that has a poor blood supply. Those fibers are so close together that they barely leave room for the cells, let alone blood vessels. That can mean it's slow to heal. So if you've ever had a sprain that tore a tendon or a ligament, it can take a while for that to really get better, because without the blood supply, they don't have the nutrients to repair themselves. So, dense regular is used for holding things together when you're going to have tension on it trying to pull it apart. For a tendon connecting muscle to bone, the muscle itself is exerting that tension. You contract the muscle, it pulls on the tendon, and if the tendon could stretch, it would just stretch it. You want it to not stretch so that it will pull on the bone and move your body. But at the same time, you need it to be flexible so that you can have your joints in different positions. Questions on any of the connective tissue proper? For specialized connective tissues, you've got blood with a fluid matrix. And then if we ranked them from soft to hard, your connective tissue proper would go in there. And then cartilage with a hard gel, bone that's fully solid. And blood, no fibers. Differences in fibers are what determine the type of cartilage. The cells in cartilage get a special name called chondrocytes, which just means cartilage cells. And because the matrix